The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. Now, we've been arguing about what philosophy is since the Greeks invented it 2,500 years ago. The layman will generally concede that it's appropriate to consider how we can know what we can know, whether there's a God, what's right and wrong, things like that. But he often finds himself bemused by talk of, mathematical classes or modal logic or the nature of propositions. And in some ways, Ludwig Wittgenstein is the poster boy for the irrelevance of philosophy. Bertrand Russell said that he clarified questions but had no interest in answering them. And yet Wittgenstein was sure that he had solved philosophy. Before we come to any of that, we'll be considering Wittgenstein's remarkable life story. Anthony Gottlieb has written a marvellously concise and fascinating new biography of him. If a novelist came up with this life story, you might think he was overdoing it.
Ludwig and his youngest brother were the only two of the five sons not to end their own lives. The whole Wittgenstein family didn't really feel the need to be polite.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Anthony, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
We just have to talk about, or start with, his background and his family. Vienna at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th is an amazing place. I now need to know a lot more about it because I've learned quite a lot from the book.
Yes, it is. It is fascinating because Vienna was the center of a large multilingual, multi-ethnic empire. People from all over in Central Europe, if they had talent and ambition, would end up in Vienna. That's part of the explanation why so many people heard of, came from, or
But Freud, of course, is and Brahms.
Yes, he was
there.
one of the many ones, and both of those people had connections with the Wittgenstein family, Brahms especially. So the family that Ludwig Wittgenstein was born into, they were descended from German Jews, but they had converted 2 generations before Ludwig's birth to Protestantism on the Wittgenstein male on paternal side. And Ludwig's father, Karl Wittgenstein, was one of the most important industrialists in Europe. In fact, The Economist, which I used to work for, but long before I worked there, said in the late 19th century, just before Karl Wittgenstein died, that he was the most important industrialist in Austria.
They call him an Austrian Andrew Carnegie, almost.
Yes, they did. Yes, and Carnegie was actually a friend of his, and
They knew everybody, didn't they, the Wittgensteins?
yes, Brahms, who you mentioned before, he was friends of Ludwig's grandfather and used to hang out with them, and then Ludwig's own parents. Brahms, lived just around the corner from what was known as the Wittgenstein Palais, and he visited quite often, and they performed his works there. And of course, he was the greatest living composer in Vienna.
Well, of course, music was very important too. Wittgenstein, but the whole Wittgenstein family, they were steeped in it. In fact, in the book, you say that if they had a religion at all, it was not Protestantism so much as German culture and German music.
Yes, that remark I was making about assimilated and converted Jews, in German Jews in general at the time, but it was very much true of that family. And very strikingly, Ludwig said of his mother, who lived for music and was a very, very talented pianist, that she could never bring a thought to completion except at the piano. And one of her other children, Amina, Ludwig's oldest sister, said that their mother really couldn't cope with complex sentences of words, but she could transpose any piece of music and play.
She was a prodigy, wasn't she? She could come home and play something you just heard.
Yes, she was a prodigy. Anyway, the mother seems to have communicated with the children only via music. They were brought up on a diet of music. The family correspondence is full of references to music throughout this quite long period when there's World War One, World War Two, persecutions, suicides. They always come back to, I just heard this marvelous piece, or we're going to this, or what do you think about this? All music, music, music. In his Tractatus, in his early work, Wittgenstein talks a great deal about the inexpressible and what goes beyond words and what you can't put in words. Now, it seems to me that since he was essentially brought up on a diet of the verbally inexpressible in the form of music, which was the thing given the highest value in his household, and through which he could communicate with his mother, there was no other way. Seems to me this must be connected with his and give rise to his interest in the concept of the inexpressible and the valuable inexpressible. Yeah. So the family was marked by tragedy. There were 5 boys of Ludwig's generation, and Ludwig and his youngest brother, Paul, who was a pianist, were the only 2 of the 5 sons not to end their own lives.
So suicide was kind of a big thing in Vienna at that time, though. It was
It was quite remarkable how many young people in their 20s and so on, roundabout, killed themselves. There are no really good explanations, but one thing that I think is relevant to some degree is that the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Crown Prince, killed himself, and it was the year that Ludwig was born, or the year before, I think. That had an immense impact on the Viennese population. It was regarded as the most immensely shocking event, and I rather suspect that some of the suicides were, to some extent, copycats.
you tell us
There's a theory that it can be contagious, as it were.
you tell us in the book that the Crown Prince killed himself with a lover, but
Yes.
she was very young and she didn't realize that he'd already tried to persuade several other women to
Yes,
kill
she
themselves
felt it
with
was
him.
probably a little more personal than in fact it was. I should say, having mentioned these tragedies of the family, that the general view, which I found nothing to contradict, was that it was the very high expectations of the father in his sons that caused much of the problem. Certainly, Ludwig was always afraid that he wasn't doing the right thing, that he wasn't decent enough. He knew that his father didn't really want him to go into philosophy, but to go into engineering or business.
Which, of course, he did go into engineering.
He did for a
We'll
while,
come to
yeah.
that in a little while,
Sure,
because his
sure.
life is unbelievable. I want to say a little more about the family, because they were fabulously wealthy. Carl, when we're talking about him being this industrialist, the family were unbelievably well placed, privileged, and
Yes, extremely.
rich.
Yeah.
Just incredibly rich.
And they really held themselves above the aristocracy because they were so cultivated. And in fact, Karl, the father, turned down an offer of nobility. They had a very, very grand manner, I think. In fact, Brahms said something quite funny of the generation above Ludwig. He said the Wittgensteins, when they're at home, they go about as if at court.
And his whole life, Ludwig was described as imperious by various different people.
His manner, yes. Now, this will probably come out again later, but almost Ludwig was a big paradox. He was full of contradictions and sort of conflicting influences, and he went one moment one way and one way the other. And sometimes he was full of self-doubt. I mean, a lot, really. But this did not stop him from being a commanding presence who had this impact on many figures in philosophy, including Bertrand Russell early on, and some of Wittgenstein's pupils, where they would be sort of so impressed by his manner and his personality that they would agree with what he said before they fully understood it. They would say that. So that was something like.
But also, he wasn't the kind of person who was asking for other people's opinions, was he? He was
A lot of the time, not certainly
he
not.
did expect his pronouncements to be accepted.
Yes, but there is a big but. There is always a big but with Wittgenstein. When he was giving his lectures, which were sort of informal conversations in his rooms, there would be long silences in which he would groan and hold his head and say, why am I so stupid? And in his notebooks, he'll talk about, why can't I understand this? Why is my work not going well? I really don't know what I'm talking about. This is rubbish. Referring to something he'd just written down. So he was both sort of proud and arrogant and the opposite.
He was a massive contradiction, yes.
Yes.
But before we get onto that, we'll go back to him. He's educated at home until he's 14.
Yeah.
And then he's sent off to a school. He and his he and his younger brother Paul are sent off
Yeah,
to schools, to different schools. And he's sent to I don't know what the equivalent would be, like a secondary modern in
Yes.
old British terms.
Like not a grammar school. It wasn't.
Yeah,
this,
it was a school that wasn't going to send you to university, for instance. It wouldn't.
Yes, that's right.
qualify
Because
for.
Ludwig was not academically good at school, unlike his brother Paul, who went to a better school.
Well, I mean, does that chime with anything I was saying earlier on about him refusing to, or imagining he already knew everything, or
No, I don't think. Well, Harry,
he didn't like being taught, did he?
First thing I should say, no, that's true. First thing I should say is we don't really know what he was like at that age. Certainly later on, he very much had the marks of a self-taught person. In fact, a school teacher who met him in a prisoner of war camp, they both ended up in. The first thing he noted about him was, this remarkable chap is, evidently self-taught. So given that Karl Wittgenstein, the father, also sort of ran away from school and didn't have much formal education and had this very strong view that most subjects didn't need to be taught, the exceptions were Latin and maths, according to him. The rest you could get by your own reading, and that's why all the Wittgenstein children up to that moment were educated at home. So yes, I suspect that at school, Wittgenstein Ludwig wouldn't have paid all that much attention, not because he knew it already, but because the Wittgensteins were like that. We're going to do this our own way.
And then he goes to once he's graduated, he's sent to Manchester University, my alma mater, to be an engineer.
So he went to Manchester, which actually was a place that a lot of German science and engineering people were sent to, because it was absolutely one of the best places in Europe, and it had this long association with Germans and Germany and German culture. They had this great orchestra, Halle Orchestra, with German or Austrian conductor. So it's like perfectly natural for him to be there. But while he was at Manchester, he got interested in the philosophy of mathematics. Some of the other students pointed him towards this book, The Principles of Mathematics, by Bertrand Russell. And the rest is history, and that's what led him into philosophy.
Well, the rest is history insofar as at the age of 22, he then goes and sort of collars Russell and
Yes.
sits him down and has a man-to-man talk as though they're
Yes.
equals.
Yes,
And
that's very strange.
Wittgenstein, even in later life, admits that he never read any philosophy or hardly
Very
any,
little. Yeah.
and said probably that was too much anyway.
Yes, well, that was a very Wittgenstein thing, to go along to see that there is this interesting man, Bertrand Russell, and to just make it a point to see him, march in and talk with him as an equal. And it's luckily for posterity, at the time when Wittgenstein waltzes in and very rapidly becomes the most interesting thing going on in Russell's life. I mean, Russell was blown away. While this was going on, Russell was having this passionate affair with Lady Ottilie Murrell. And in those days, the post was like email. You could write to and fro 3 times a day. And they did. And the letters are preserved. And these letters from Bertrand Russell to Lady Ottilie contain this very detailed account of the young Wittgenstein. So that's just really lucky.
Well, at one point,
Love letters
he
exist.
writes to her that he's a mad genius. I think we'd call him autistic today, wouldn't we? Do we?
Oh, that's a big question. People have suggested that he was on the autism spectrum because his behavior sometimes suggests that he sort of doesn't know how to pick up social cues. Now, I think that's actually completely wrong because he was extremely sensitive to people's manner, expression, gesture, the nature of their dealings with him, because he would get terribly upset sometimes about the way a friend had behaved towards him. And we can tell this from letters he would then write about it. Now, he was sometimes very, I suppose what we would call now, sort of inappropriately truthful. Like, for example, there's a famous story, which is in the book, where he is at a garden party in England at the economist Keynes's house. Keynes has just got married to this ballerina, Lydia, and Lydia, trying to make conversation with the young Wittgenstein, says, "Oh, isn't that a beautiful tree?" And he fiercely says, "What do you mean?" And then she bursts into tears. No, I think he was probably rather in a bad mood. But the point is, the whole Wittgenstein family didn't really feel the need to be polite all, or indeed much of the time. If some thought occurred to them, they would just say it. And while many people recorded that Ludwig didn't have any small talk, that's completely wrong. He just didn't have small talk with various people, especially philosophers he didn't know particularly well. But there were all sorts of people in his life, including lovers and members of his family, where, I mean, there's a very great deal of trivia, small talk, jokes, almost always very heavy and bad. But no, I think the autism spectrum picture is not right.
Fair enough. So Bertrand Russell is the other big figure in this story. He takes Wittgenstein on. He almost immediately recognizes that Wittgenstein is going to do things that he, Russell,
Yeah.
would never have been able to
Very
do.
quickly. Not absolutely at first, because first he writes, I think he's a bit of a fool, but like 10 days later, he's a genius. Yeah.
And so he sort of wafts him in to the university as an undergraduate, even though, I mean, today it wouldn't happen. You need qualification, you need your A levels and things like that. In that day, and it does seem that once Russell had decided that Wittgenstein was a genius, the normal rules didn't apply to him. He didn't need to satisfy any of the usual criteria.
Yeah.
So he becomes an undergraduate very quickly. He's promoted to a research student and things. And what's he doing then? Because he's there for a couple of years with Russell.
Yes. So, well, he gets very interested in Russell's work on the foundations of mathematics and logic. At the very beginning, you mentioned sort of technical mathematical logic, and that was his great first passion in philosophy. And he saw himself, at least initially, as did Russell, as a sort of collaborator of Russell, working on the same sort of stuff. And as you mentioned very quickly, Russell came to think that Wittgenstein would be his successor. He really looked forward to that and wanted that. You know, Russell really was, I think, magnificent throughout in their relationship, and Wittgenstein could be like extremely difficult, and they fell out. And the end in his later life, when Wittgenstein's philosophy was a little different, Russell didn't think much of it at all. But he never really said a bad word about Wittgenstein until after he died. He encouraged Wittgenstein. I don't know where he would have been philosophically without him, where Ludwig would have been without him. He put up with a great deal. I think it was magnificent.
And then, of course, Wittgenstein decides he needs to be on his own to do some serious work. Yeah. So he goes to Norway and starts work. And this is 1913, so of course we can see what's coming. 1914 is coming, and the war breaks out. He enlists in the First
He does enlist, although he didn't need to because of a medical condition. He thought that somehow the experience of the war would help him through his sort of personal sufferings. I came across records of various other people of the same period who went into the war for the same reasons. It was sort of like not uncommon. They thought something good would come out of the war for him personally.
Well, it's in the 4 years of the First World War. He's scribbling a little thing called the Tractatus.
Yes, he continued his philosophical work, in the trenches and on leave. There were long periods away from the front on the leave, but some of the time, while he was fighting, he was working hard at philosophy. So his notebooks from this period, which exist, that sort of veer backwards and forwards between private remarks about the war and his sufferings in the camp and how he really hates all the other soldiers, and stuff about logic, his work. Yeah.
Wittgenstein is saying that he solved philosophy with this book.
He said that then, he certainly.
Yeah. We're going to work through later on, but having written it, because at that point he then says, "Oh, I've done it all. I give up philosophy after he's written this."
Of course, he is in his 20s, and there are other examples of great philosophers who, when they're in their 20s, they really think they've sorted it all out.
Is it possible for the layman to say what the Tractatus is, what it does? Yes.
I mean, it's notoriously difficult, and a lot of it's in symbols. And I spend this.
And one of the symbols he invents and doesn't explain, you tell me.
That's right. And then in the introduction, Russell helpfully explains it to the reader. Overall, I would. I discussed the Tractatus in the book a bit and try to explain it for the layman. But the key things that we could say for now are that Wittgenstein thought there were, at that stage, that there were limits to language, to what could be meaningfully expressed, and that philosophical problems went beyond them. And once you correctly understood the way language works, you would see what was sayable, as you would sometimes put it in German, and what was not sayable. And the philosophical problems were solved, he believed, by himself at that stage, by pointing out that they concerned unsayable matters. So they weren't genuine problems, in a sense. And so by providing a correct theory of language and showing where its limits lay, it was in that sense that in the Tractatus he thought.
So he's saying that you can ask these questions, but if it's possible that it's just not a meaningful question.
Well, not literally meaningful, but there's yet again a paradox. Towards the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein sort of admits that the Tractatus itself is saying the unsayable, the way it talks about these philosophical problems. And there continues to be much debate about whether that just writes the whole thing off as incoherent or not. But his idea in the Tractatus is that by understanding his propositions in that book, you somehow transcend them, you use them as a ladder to climb up and out and beyond the philosophical problems. I should just quickly point out, though, that although he regarded philosophical statements of philosophical problems as going beyond the limits of language and as meaningless in that sense, he thought they were still in some sense important, and he said that he would never attack or undermine or make fun of people who wondered about these questions. He wasn't dismissive in the way that the logical positivists later wanted to be.
And they annoyed him, didn't they? Because they sort of took credit.
Well, almost everything annoyed him in some way, but he was an enormous influence on them.
You quote Frank Ramsey, the philosopher Frank Ramsey, is saying, if philosophy is nonsense, as the Tractatus says, we must take seriously that it's nonsense and not pretend, as Wittgenstein does, that it's important nonsense.
Yes, I think Ramsey was exactly right in this diagnosis of what was going on there. I should repeat again, what we're talking about now is the early philosophy of Wittgenstein, the Tractatus.
There's a lovely quote from Russell, from Bertrand Russell, that you give us, that he says, I'm sure it's an important book, but I'm not sure it's right.
Yes.
It's not then the end of philosophy.
No, it certainly turns out not to be.
He thinks it might be. So, having solved philosophy as far as he's concerned in his 20s, what does he do with his life?
He wants to become a school teacher. He decided at the very end of the war, he was in this prisoner of war camp, taken prisoner by the Italians. And it's either during the war or then, I can't remember exactly. I mean, before he was in the prisoner of war camp or during it, but at some stage around about then, he decides he really wants to be a school teacher. So the first thing, a primary school teacher. So the first thing that he does when he's released is he gives away all the family money.
Let's do that a bit more. He was fabulously rich, and he gives all of his money away. I mean, all
to some of his siblings, just leaving out one who was separately had a more secure fortune.
Presumably,
Well,
Wittgenstein thought he unencumbered him, does he?
Exactly. That's exactly what he thought. It wasn't, as people have sometimes said, to give away money to good causes. That wasn't it. He did not believe in doing that.
He didn't know the world was that improvable, did he? He had too much
No,
Schopenhauer as a youth.
exactly. And there's some evidence that he also thought that having a lot of money is bad for people, but his siblings already had a lot. They were too far gone for this to matter. Possible that was a small, but the main thing is it was to unburden himself. So he unburdens himself of the money. He enrolls. He does teacher training, and then he gets jobs teaching in primary schools in Upper Austria for several years. Three different places, moves from one to the next.
And to what purpose? Well, who can say? Yeah, he presumably found some satisfaction in it, and then he becomes an architect. Or at least an amateur.
I think he found really quite a lot of satisfaction in it. I mean, as with the war and other soldiers, he did rather find most of the people he had to deal with as rather odious. But I think he was an extremely gifted teacher. I mean, this suited some pupils and not others. And he had a temper, and sometimes he would hit some of the children, which was sort of normal then. But there was one particular case where he hit a boy, and he felt so awful about it that he then resigned, even though the principal of the school said there's really absolutely no need for that. So, there's quite a lot of evidence that some pupils didn't like him and had a bad time, but an awful lot of them did. And one thing I'd like to mention is it does seem to me that his experience of teaching in these schools affected the nature of his later philosophy, because in the later philosophy, both in the lectures and in the surviving writings and in the accounts by his students, there's an enormous emphasis on considering how we learn various words and expressions, or how we teach various words and expressions, because he is still in the later philosophy running with the theme that philosophical problems in some way arise out of language, and the philosopher's job is to see language correctly and show how philosophical problems needn't arise. And one way he does that, the central way he does that, I think, in his later philosophy, is to get people to consider how they learn and how they teach various concepts. Now, if you look back at his earlier work before he was a teacher, the Tractatus, all the surviving philosophical writings, letters, what have you, you never get a single mention, I think there's one irrelevant in passing mention, of learning or teaching. And afterwards, it's all about learning and teaching. Very little has been said about. I'm amazed that writers about Wittgenstein have not said more about this before.
Because there are two more
insight.
main works, aren't there? There was a collection of writings called the Blue Books, which was published during his lifetime, and then posthumously something he'd been working on that he'd never really quite got straight, which was a philosophical investigation.
The main later work is the Philosophical Investigations, which was not quite finished to his satisfaction, but very, very close. And there were all sorts of other unfinished, sketchy writings that had been published as books, that one always has to remember that they were essentially various forms of drafts of Wittgenstein. The Blue and Brown books, they were dictations of his. to his two groups of his students. There were typescripts, and they were not intended to be published to the wider world, but they were.
So how did he come back to philosophy then? After his school teaching, he comes back to Cambridge.
Friends in Cambridge, including Keynes, we mentioned before, and Ramsay, had been in touch with him for a while and saying, "Look, any chance you might come back?" And he would usually say, "No, I've said everything I've got to say." But he evidently was still interested in philosophy. He was still reading various things. He was in discussions with various Viennese philosophers, a little bit, the ones who became known as the logical positivists. They persuaded him to go to a lecture by a philosopher of mathematics, a mathematician called Brewer. And it's often said that his attendance at this lecture is what made him interested in philosophy again. I think that's not quite right. I think that was sort of brewing for quite a while. Anyway, he is persuaded to at least go to England to Cambridge for a visit. He doesn't sort of say, "I'm definitely getting back to philosophy and staying," but as it turned out, he did stay and he got back into philosophy.
Now, he left Cambridge without a degree the first time. He comes back and he's awarded a PhD
On the basis of potatoes, yes.
Via a Viva Voce by Bertrand Russell and G.D. Moore, yes. You described this as a mere formality,
Yeah.
which it was, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Because-
Again, it's this sense of exceptionalism. Moore had tried to get him an undergraduate degree by saying, send something in and we'll use that as a dissertation.
Yeah. But he, yes, and I couldn't be
And
bothered with
Wittgenstein
that.
couldn't be bothered because and got cross, fell out with Moore.
Oh, yes, very cross.
Insulted Moore because Moore said, "Well, it's got to be presented this way with like notes and
Yeah. He had
and
similar-
15 years they don't speak."
Yes, he was very, very rude to them.
high-handed.
Then they got back together again. But yes, absolutely. But one thing I should mention in that context, so one of his American woman pupils was one of the very few pupils who actually sort of stood up to him and says, "Really, you're a ridiculous bully. Stop bullying me." In letters and also in person. And yet when Alice Ambrose was her name, became an important philosopher in her own right, she said to a friend when discussing this matter of Raz with Wittgenstein, "And yet there was so much in him to love."
Yes, why did people like him so much? Because despite all these things that I've picked up, and I think I would have found him very hard going, he inspired an enormous amount of loyalty.
Yes, well, there were two things. I mean, there were some people to whom he was like virtually never nasty. Mainly fairly casual acquaintances, but there are people who had some dealings with him and then wrote about it afterwards and said, "I can't understand why you're saying there's such a monster." He wasn't at all. Evidently he was to some people and not others. And then with quite a lot of his close friends, like for example his pupil von Richt, who he recommended as his own successor as professor of philosophy, and von Richt did become his successor, who was a very different type of philosopher to Wittgenstein, which is maybe partly why Wittgenstein picked him. But anyway, so von Richt thought the world of him, but he also said that being with him was often a nightmare. Every day was like the day of judgment, he said. Wittgenstein would stand in judgment on it. It was terrible, I think, von Richt said once, but he was still very, very close friends with him and thought the world of him.
So he had close personal relationships. We haven't discussed his love life at all. Was he gay? I mean, that's essentially
Yes, I mean he was either gay or bisexual. Now, he claimed once to have had. He said, without giving any details, that he had once had sex with a woman. Whether true or not doesn't really
proud boast.
mean much. But there was definitely a young woman he was in love with in the period when he was an architect, and while he went back to Cambridge, much younger than him. A fair bit younger than him. Actually, one thing that I discovered looking carefully at his known love life is that everybody he fell in love with or is known to have fallen in love with, was aged between 20 and 22 at the time. And this remained a constant throughout his life, from which you can deduce
good
that
look.
the age difference at the very end was considerable.
Well, he wasn't very old when he died, but he was
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. But
62 or something, wasn't he? Something like that.
yes. But just to go back, so there was this one woman, and he recorded in his diary enjoying these long kisses with her. So it wasn't. I mean, he certainly was proposing only a platonic relationship with her, in the sense that he did not, because he did at one point suggest marriage. He did not want to have sex with her, but it wasn't totally non-physical. He seemed to enjoy kissing. But primarily, his important loves, his longer loves, especially the one of the last few years of his life, which gave him such happiness, with men. Yeah.
Something else I wanted to pick up. You mentioned his personal sufferings and how he dealt with those. He had a very strange relationship with religion. I mean, he seems to have been an atheist, and yet have had quite a lively relationship with God nonetheless.
Yes, I mean, he was always going on about God and praying, but his one of his sisters, who knew him very well, said that Ludwig has no conception of an external God. We don't quite know what he's talking about by God, but it's not God in the usual sense. And one of his close colleagues and friends, Elizabeth Anscombe, who was his main translator of the later works, who was a Catholic, said he had no form of Christian belief, even though he was reading the Gospels, especially early in life, and he described himself as having seeing things from a religious point of view. Now, he also said that his conception of God was that of the fearful judge. My reading of this is that it was the overpowering sense of this father, his father, looking down and judging him, that made him so concerned about decency and doing the right thing and thinking of God as a fearful judge.
Freud would have had a field day, wouldn't he?
Yes, Freud actually analysed a nephew of Wittgenstein's.
Well, like all the best books, this one is one that makes me want to read some more. Obviously, I have already said I need to know a lot more about Vienna at the turn of the century. I'm wondering if I should read the Tractatus. I mean, should I? I'm not a philosopher. How inaccessible are Wittgenstein's writings?
Well, the Tractatus, which, I mean, for one thing, has a lot of symbols. If you don't know much mathematical logic, you're going to find a lot of it impenetrable apart from the end. Now, there's some extremely good secondary sources on this, some of which I mentioned in further reading at the back. The Tractatus, unless you've done a fair bit of reading around it first,
heavy weather, you think?
Yes. The later work, I would suggest the blue and brown books. But so the thing about the later work is you'll definitely be able to understand all the words in all the sentences, all of it.
I can see where this is going.
But you, and by which I mean well, almost everybody actually, including professional philosophers, the big problem with getting anything out of his later work, although of course a lot of people have, but it's not at all, you have to work out for yourself the relevance to philosophical problems of what he is saying. And Wittgenstein actually said this himself once at some point. I won't get his words exactly right, but he said, people will understand what I'm saying in these later works, but they won't understand why I'm saying it. So you'll see discussions of language and mind and how we behave in certain situations and what we say under certain conditions. And you'll say, yes, but how does this connect with the philosophical problems? And it's not that they don't at all, but you have to do a little bit of work to make the connections. And again, there's a lot of very good secondary literature. So bottom line, start with some of the later works.
Oh, well, I'll do that. Or rather, I'll start with yours, which
Why not?
I think you can probably tell I enjoyed no end. That is Anthony Gottlieb's Ludwig Wittgenstein, Philosophy in the Age of Airplanes, published by Yale University Press at £16.99. Anthony, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.
I sort of wanted to do Weininger as well, but I thought we could. It's such a rabbit hole that we would never get back to
Yes, and actually the
Wittgenstein.
Weininger thing is really difficult because everyone always wants to know, so what was it in Weininger? Why was he so keen
Yeah.
on Weininger?
Impossible to
knows,
know
'cause
because
he
he
didn't
sounds
say.
like firstly a monster and also a
Oh, he was a
crackpot.
monster.
Because I mean, weird ideas about Jews and about sexuality, about women,
yeah.
and of course, Vaninger's always saying, "Oh, but I don't mean you as a Jew. I mean the Jew in
Yes,
general,
exactly.
or the woman in
Yes,
general."
yes,
As a sort of, and you can hear echoes of that today of people saying, "No, I'm not anti-Semitic. It's just it's not Jews I don't like.
Right, it's just the
Jewishness." Or,
Yes,
yes.
No, but the reason why it's so hard to discuss Weininger is that I can't come up with, and I've never come across anyone who can come up with an answer. So what exactly did he get out of Weininger? We just don't
Yeah,
know.
it's
We just know he
bizarre.
was very